Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, but more specifically, we're going to discuss the Bitcoin dominance. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Links in the description below. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, before we get too far into the dominance video, I do want to remind people why we talk about it, especially for new people coming into the market, which I imagine there are some new people coming into the market. The reason we talk about Bitcoin dominance is because it helps us better understand what part of the asset class is going to outperform another part, right? So if you think that dominance is going higher, then Bitcoin heavy crypto portfolios tend to do really well. If you think Bitcoin dominance is going to go lower, then altcoin heavy crypto portfolios can do okay. So it all depends on where you're coming from. Now, remember, if Bitcoin USD is going up, it can take altcoins with it. But the only reason those altcoins went anywhere is because Bitcoin went there first. So we've been talking about Bitcoin dominance and how it's in an uptrend for the last 2.5 years or so. And it's been a long journey, and I mean, it feels like every single step of the way, there's been a lot of hurdles. I know a lot of people have not believed in the dominance rally and have called the highs on it basically every time it moves higher for the last 2.5 years, but it continues to go higher. We are now at a new yearly high. I mean, 54.37% is a new yearly high. You can see this wick over here on this candle back in October. If you look at the high right here, you can see that it was 54.35%. So Bitcoin dominance is now at a new yearly high, meaning collectively the altcoin market bleeds back to Bitcoin. And this is one of the reasons why my own crypto portfolio has been Bitcoin heavy for a very long time. Now, in this video, I want to talk about this trend in dominance because while it has been a great ride to see dominance go from 39% to 54%, I do think it will go higher. I think it's going to rally for at least a few more weeks, maybe a few more months. But we should be aware that market conditions change. And I want to talk in this video about what to look for when those market conditions change. And the reason we must understand that is because if you want exposure to other aspects of the market, we must understand where Bitcoin dominance is going to top out, okay? There's a lot of people that have believed in the Bitcoin dominance rally, and they've kept their crypto portfolios Bitcoin heavy, and they've watched a lot of altcoins bleed back to Bitcoin. There's a few that haven't, right? And I to those people that took on the risk of some altcoins, and if you've seen some great gains, congratulations, right? I'm not here to minimize that or to pretend like it hasn't happened. I said way back that there would be some altcoins that would outperform Bitcoin, right? There always are, and there always will be a few every single cycle that do that. But it should not detract from the general idea that alts have bled against Bitcoin. Bitcoin dominance remains basically the only metric that I can find that has been above the bull market support band in terms of weekly closes for the entire year. Even Bitcoin USD, which has had a pretty great run, still spent some time over here below the bull market support band, whereas Bitcoin dominance never really went there. There was a single wick below it, but no weekly closes below the bull market support band for the entire year. I mean, the year's not over with yet, so anything can happen, but it's been a crazy run for Bitcoin dominance. It looks like it might be going into its own blow-off top. Now, I've said that dominance has been going up for 2.5 years, but if you look at this chart, you will again point out that the low was put in September of 2022, which is certainly not 2.5 years ago. I mean, that's just over a year ago. The reason why I say that dominance has been going up for 2.5 years, as opposed to just saying for a little over a year, is because I think the dominance trend to the upside started back over here in May. Now, you could easily point out to the low in September of 2021, or the low in January 2022, or the low over here in September of 2022. You could point to all of those things and say, well, those were lower lows on Bitcoin dominance. But the rebuttal to that is that the reason why they were lower lows is because of the stablecoin market cap, right? The stablecoin market cap was going up a lot back then. And if you go and you exclude, so this is Bitcoin dominance, including stables, which is basically the chart that you're just looking at, right, where it was slowly going lower. If you exclude stables, you can see that the low for dominance was put in May of 2021, right? So all of these other moves by dominance were actually higher lows when you exclude the stablecoin market. And the reason I look at Bitcoin dominance is to not try to guess where the stablecoin market's going. I'm not saying the stablecoin market is not relevant. I do think the stablecoin market is relevant. The point that I'm trying to make is that I use Bitcoin dominance to better understand all Bitcoin valuations, right? That's why I care about it. So I care about how it's performing, how Bitcoin's performing with respect to the altcoin market. Okay, so what if the stablecoin market cap went up 20%, then fine. But I want to understand how altcoins are performing against Bitcoin. And when you exclude stablecoins, which is what we're doing right here, you can see that in fact dominance has been putting in higher lows since May of 2021. And it seems like one of these things that no one has really believed. Like most people have not believed it. Some people became bullish on Bitcoin dominance only a few months ago. Some people that were bullish on it stopped being bullish on it earlier this year. But you can see again that it continues to go higher, and dominance is now above 54%, and it just put in a new yearly high. So from here, I think the relevant things to just take a brief look at are, what are the targets? What would essentially cause dominance to top out, and how do you plan for a scenario like that? Because if you believed in the Bitcoin dominance rally, then I imagine your crypto portfolio has been Bitcoin heavy. I will say, no matter what happens with Bitcoin dominance, it never hurts to have your crypto portfolio be Bitcoin heavy. Because the issue is that, there could come a time, there probably will come a time where alts durably start to outperform Bitcoin, but there's no guarantee that the altcoins you buy start to outperform Bitcoin. And therefore, having a healthy percentage of Bitcoin in your portfolio over the years makes a lot of sense. But you always have to remember that the markets shift with time, and at some point alts will start to durably outperform Bitcoin. I don't think we're at that point yet, but it could be coming up within a few months or so. And that doesn't necessarily mean that alt USD pairs have to go up. So I'll also explain that. So one thing that I want to go through here with dominance is to look at the retracement levels. This is a tool that I think is kind of hit or miss, honestly. But last cycle, you can see that dominance retraced all the way back up to the 618. And if it were to do the same thing this cycle, it would put dominance up at 60%, right? Now, again, I'm not calling for dominance to go to 80% or 90%. I'm just saying, hey guys, I think it's going to go to 60%. It seems like a reasonable target. You can see that last cycle, it did stall out a little bit for a week or two at around the 0.5 level, which is coincidentally where it's approaching, right? So the 0.5 level corresponds to around 56% dominance. 56% dominance. So I'm looking for an initial move by dominance to around that 56% level. And then from there, I think it will break higher. Now, there's an interesting idea embedded within this chart. And all of it is how it relates to Bitcoin USD, okay? One thing to remember is that the theory behind dominance is that it goes up no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD until we get back to looser monetary policy, okay? Looser monetary policy can often come in the halving year, which, by the way, happens to correspond to election years. Market is currently thinking that the Fed's going to start cutting by March, okay? And again, the market has been wrong a lot. And I've been against the market. I mean, when the market was calling for 3.5% for the terminal rate, I said back then it's likely going to go to 5.5%. It takes the market a long time to sort of digest these things, but I do think we will get rate cuts next year. And the reason why that is relevant, right? The reason why that's relevant is because if you look at interest rates, you can see that last cycle, dominance did not top until we started to get rate cuts, right? You can see that clearly. It wasn't until rate cuts where dominance started to top. So some people I know looked at the dominance chart and thought, well, since it topped out in September of 2019, that it might have to top out in September of 2023. But I think the more relevant aspect of it, and I think I think this shows that it's more effective, more related to monetary policy than just sort of the time in the cycle, is that it took rate cuts for dominance to top out. Why should I assume that this time is different? I won't. I don't assume it. I assume that this time will not be different, and I assume that dominance will likely go higher until we're around the time of rate cuts. And it could be plus or minus a month or so, right? Maybe even 2. I don't know. But I do think that dominance will continue higher until we're back to looser monetary policy. Now, the interesting thing about the move that dominance had back over here from the breakdown point to the 618, it stalled out at the 0.5 for a week, and then it went higher. But the reason why that's interesting is because this move right here by dominance, this final move from the 0.5 to the 618, that occurred after Bitcoin had put in its yearly high. After, right? So if you think about this breakdown point, 56% is still a couple percent above where we currently are, right? That's right there. But the 618 is all the way up here at 60%. Remember, last cycle, Bitcoin USD topped out when Bitcoin dominance hit the 0.5. Let's overlay Bitcoin USD onto the chart. You can see it right here. Draw the line across the down the screen. Right there, that's where Bitcoin topped out. It topped out where dominance hit the 0.5 retracement. Even though Bitcoin topped out when dominance was at the 0.5, Bitcoin dominance still went to the 618 after Bitcoin's yearly high was in, right after that. And Bitcoin basically did a double top over here, but it still went higher after Bitcoin USD had put in the high. So when I look at the chart, if we retrace up here to the 50, to the 0.5, and we're at the 0.5 retracement, there's no guarantee that it's done there, right? Like it might stall there for a week or something, but I still think it could go up to 60% or so. And I think all this can happen relatively quickly. The market is screaming that rate cuts are coming, right? That's what the market is thinking. What's fascinating about all of this, and I know that the gold has had a pretty big retrace today after getting that breakout yesterday. But remember, there have been prior times where we saw Bitcoin break out and then come back down and then keep going up. We also previously saw, treasuries long in the yield curve break out, come back down. Everyone thought it wasn't going to go anywhere, and then it went up. So yes, gold has had a pretty significant pullback here. It doesn't mean that it's not going to go back up. It very well could. And why that is interesting is if you look really closely at gold on this chart, if we overlay gold, you can see that there was a similar sort of breakout here in June of 2019, right? And now you can kind of see the same thing is going on right here. It's almost identical, in fact, right? Like gold had a top and then had a lower high, and then it broke out right over here. It had a top, and then there's these lower highs in here, right? You kind of get these in higher highs going into it, right? I mean, it's a really similar pattern, in fact. But then now it's potentially breaking out, which is arguably right here. And the reason why that's interesting is because that might kick us into the final stage of the Bitcoin dominance rally, right? Where the dominance goes up, for another 4 weeks, maybe 8 weeks. I don't really know, maybe 12, I don't know, right? Probably around the time of rate cuts, and then it could finally top out. gold is sort of famous for providing a risk-off signal in markets, right? And it has done this many, many times. Oftentimes, gold will rally before rate cuts, and even when rate cuts come, it keeps going up. If you look at gold and we overlay interest rates onto this chart, what you'll see, in fact, is that a lot of times gold's rally starts before rate cuts and doesn't really stop. And you can go back in time and look at other cycles. Right here, gold started to rally before rate cuts happened, and yes, it had some pullbacks, but I mean, it still was in a parabolic rally. It can provide that risk-off signal. It's like when you look at things like TLT, the bond market. It normally tops out before risk assets do. Or sorry, it bottoms out. The 10-year yield normally tops out before risk assets do. But the bond market tends to bottom before risk assets, right? So potentially the bond market has bottomed here. I don't really know. I mean, it could go down again, but there's a reasonable chance that this is the low. And if it is, and now gold is potentially giving this signal, then perhaps it all is sort of doing the same thing that it did last cycle, right? Where you get the terminal rate somewhere up here before rate cuts, Bitcoin tops out. But remember, last cycle, Bitcoin topped out before rate cuts happened, right? This top right here occurred before the first rate cut, just like 1 or 2 months before. So I say, what are the chances that something similar is happening over here? Right, where it could top out before we start to get to these rate cuts over here, which are likely coming again next year. Probably not this year. Market thinks there's basically 0% chance they're going to cut this year, and I think that's the right decision. But honestly, if you believe in the soft landing camp, it would probably make more sense for them to start cutting sooner rather than later, because at some point we're going to start to feel the effects of all these interest rate hikes. I mean, you're not going to go through the fastest rate hiking cycle in history and not see some consequences by it in the economy. I would assume so, but I don't think the Fed's going to cut this year. Maybe they'll start cutting sometime in Q1, but we'll have to wait and see about that. So where do alts become worth the risk against Bitcoin? One thing I will say is I don't know how much I'm going to talk about dominance next cycle, because see, here's the issue is that a lot of people have been very bearish on Bitcoin dominance for the last 2 years, and they keep calling the highs on it, and it keeps going higher. But because their altcoins are being dragged up by Bitcoin, they sort of discount it and say, all right, well, it's no big deal. My altcoin is up. But the point is that you could have just had Bitcoin, taken on a lot less risk, and seen a pretty, probably you would have had a substantial reward than holding all those altcoins. The issue why it's not really fun to talk about is because I have these views on dominance, and it's like it'll go my way, but every single time it gets any type of a pullback, right? Any type of a pullback, and altcoins rally against it, I become the bad guy. Right? Not only being the bad guy, but that's what's happened, right? All these pullbacks, and altcoins get these brief rallies, and everyone loses their mind, But the trend has been up for dominance for a long time, and these altcoins are slowly losing value against Bitcoin, and they have been for a long time. Now, one thing to remember last cycle is that when dominance topped out in September of 2019, which was right around the time of rate cuts, when it topped out, it did not mean that altcoins were going to go up immediately on their USD pairs. They had bottomed out against their Bitcoin pairs. So we could get to a point where altcoins, the ones that are not going to become relics, the ones that will survive, we could get to a point where they've bottomed out against Bitcoin, but that doesn't mean they're not going down against the US dollar. And that's exactly what happened last cycle, right? Is that Bitcoin dominance topped out, but if you look at say, Bitcoin on this chart, you can see that even though dominance had topped out, Bitcoin was trending down, even though dominance had topped. Meaning that while all Bitcoin pairs were flat to up, all USD pairs were down, right? So it all depends on what your goals are, right? Are you trying to preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio? Are you trying to preserve the USD valuation of your portfolio? What are you trying to do? If you're trying to preserve this, if you're trying to preserve the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio, then dominance is a really important metric. If you're trying to preserve the USD valuation, then I still think dominance is important to help understand where to put your dollars. But if you wait until dominance tops out to go into the altcoin market, you risk buying altcoins just before they're entering into a downtrend on their USD pairs, just simply because Bitcoin is finally correcting. So I think there's a case to be made that we're sort of repeating the same thing that happened last cycle as we go into rate cuts. And if we do go into rate cuts sometime in 2024, then what does that mean? It means that Bitcoin dominance will likely begin the topping process sometime, between now and then. If you look at year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin dominance without stablecoins, this is what it looks like. Here's 2023. Here is the average of 2015 and 2019, right? It's basically just been following the average of those 2 years for a long time. It might even end the year above these two. Maybe it goes up to where 2019 was, which would still be a pretty strong move by dominance, and it could happen in a relatively short period of time. So just be open-minded to this idea that dominance can continue to go up and it can break all Bitcoin pairs down. One of the things I think that's relevant to look at is the Ether Bitcoin pair. Remember, Bitcoin rallies break all Bitcoin pairs down. All these support levels that Ether Bitcoin once held as support, they just keep breaking down. I think the last one to break will be this 0.049. As I've said before, in the end, even the giants will fall. And Ether Bitcoin has been falling. I think back to a year ago, we had the merge rally. And so many people were so bullish on Ether Bitcoin and calling for the flippening and all this other stuff. And, I was the bad guy for saying that it looked like a distribution phase. But then you zoom out and you're like, well, how was it not? I mean, it basically did the same thing that Bitcoin USD did. You get 4 tops, you get sort of this move down, and then you get another distribution double top right there. And then it's just been down ever since, lower highs and lower lows. We talked about this wedge that it was likely going to break down from, and it did, right? It eventually broke down, and it even back tested it. And we said it was likely going to back test it at around 0.058, right? So it broke down, back tested it at 0.058, and now it just continues to slowly roll over. So I think what I'm looking for is to see if Bitcoin can break Ether off of this final support level at 0.049. That's what I think needs to happen. And I think it's probably going to happen this month, is my guess. Probably could happen this month. So, and if not, I mean, it could get extended out until early 2024. You can see that, rate cuts aren't coming till early next year. But the reason why I have too much, a little bit of an issue putting too much weight into that is if you go look at year-to-date ROI of dominance in halving years, here's 2020 and 2016, it doesn't tend to go that much higher, right? So I do think that it's possible that dominance goes higher in the halving year a little bit, just because we've seen that happen in both prior halving years, but I don't necessarily know that it's going to go substantially higher, right? I think it could go a little bit higher in the halving year, but I don't know that it's going to go substantially higher in the halving year. So that's why I'm sort of the opinion that it would be more ideal in the short term if Ether Bitcoin goes ahead and breaks down before we get to the halving year. That way we can sort of reset, get into into Q1 where Ethereum normally gets some type of bounce against Bitcoin, and so on and so forth. So that's my view. I still think Ether Bitcoin needs to break down. And by the way, one altcoin has already been breaking down. If you look at and we've talked about this one for a while too, is BNB Bitcoin. It already broke these prior lows, and it's dropping. I mean, it's at levels it hasn't seen since March of 2021. March of 2021. For Ether Bitcoin to go to where it was in March of 2021, it would have to be all the way back down here at around 0.03 to 0.04. Right? So I do think that's coming. I think that is the eventual outcome. It's a slow process. It's a long grind, but I do think that is the eventual outcome. I think one thing to consider with altcoins is after Bitcoin goes on parabolic rallies, there's times where there's a rotation into altcoins, and then there's other times where there's not, and it's really hard to know. I know a lot of people are sort of taking the bet on altcoins, but it's really hard to know. Normally, altcoins do really well after a Bitcoin rally if Bitcoin puts in new highs, right? So if Bitcoin is putting in new highs, then after the rally by Bitcoin is over, then altcoins tend to run. If Bitcoin is not putting in new highs, then altcoins tend to top out when Bitcoin tops out. If you overlay total 3 onto this chart, you will see that pretty clearly, in fact, right? So like in 2019, total 3 topped out right here, right around the time, if not a little bit before, or right around the time that Bitcoin did. But over here, you can see that after Bitcoin found this high in April, alts continued to go up, right? Alts continued to go up for a while, right? It's not like they just immediately collapsed. You can see here, April, Bitcoin topped. Alts still rallied for another 2 to 3 weeks before they eventually fell down. So we have to remember that some of it could be dependent on if Bitcoin puts in a new high or not. And again, I mean, we're still relatively early in the like we're not at new highs, not yet. I mean, I'm not saying it can't happen, but I would suspect that it's probably more similar to this rally over here, and that it will top out. My guess is at a lower high. That's my guess. Okay, but I could be wrong, right? It could be wrong. My guess is that it tops out at a lower high, and then we sort of grind it out for a while in 2024. We figure out the inverted yield curve in 2024 and the fallout from that. And then, sometime beyond that is when sort of the next move begins. It's kind of interesting how these moves tend to occur 2 years. They've occurred 2 years apart, right? You have 2023, 2021, 2019, 2017. So every couple of years. But note that this high was a lower high compared to this one, just like this high could be a lower high compared to the one we had in 2021. Again, no guarantees. I know there's a lot of people calling for new highs before the halving. I'm not going to say that it can't happen. I just think it's not the most likely outcome, but anything's possible. The other thing that I wanted to mention is to look at total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin. This is also potentially breaking down at the same time that it did last cycle in terms of where we were with respect to looser monetary policy. Last cycle, you can see that alt broke down against Bitcoin right here in June. If you were to overlay interest rates onto the chart, you can see that they broke down just before we got our first rate cut that came in July. Right? It broke down right here. Rate cuts came in July. What if we're about to break down right here in December, and then rate cuts come, I don't know, in either January or March? It looks eerily similar, doesn't it? It looks eerily similar. This is now at 40%. If it breaks down, you can see what happened last cycle when it broke down. It was another 40% drop against Bitcoin or so, right, against Bitcoin. That would be a brutal drop against Bitcoin if that were to occur. The other thing that I think is important to think about is when did Bitcoin top with respect to this metric? If you pull up Bitcoin USD, you can see that it topped out when total 3 minus USDT divided by Bitcoin hit 37%. 37 to 30, well, it was this week where it went from 38 to 36%. We're not that far away from that. I mean, we're at 40% right now. So if we were to see altcoins, if we were to see this metric go to like 36, 37, 38%, then that could be a warning sign that things are getting pretty testy and that the rally could be running out of steam. It didn't have that much more energy in it once we reached this level. Now, at the time, Bitcoin got a substantial pullback, but then it went back up and kind of put in a double top or a lower high. What would be interesting is if something like that were to play out again, then whatever high we put in December, maybe we retest that high in January, or maybe it's a lower high on the spot ETF stuff. If you think about the merge, Ethereum did not top out on its USD pair the month of the merge. It topped out in August, a month before. It then topped out against Bitcoin on the day of the merge. So what if Bitcoin were to do the same thing where it finds some type of a top in December, and then in January we have all the hype surrounding the spot ETF, but it doesn't take out the December high, but dominance goes up to 60%. I wouldn't be surprised to see something like that play out, where dominance goes to 60%, and then right around that time we're going into the cutting part of the cycle sometime in early 2024. It's fascinating how it all lines up, and it makes sense, right? I mean, when you get into looser monetary policy, you would expect higher risk assets to start to at least keep pace with Bitcoin, even if Bitcoin's going down. But I don't think we're at that phase yet. I still think that there is a bias here for dominance to go higher and break all Bitcoin pairs off of their support levels. I mean, even today, you can see that a lot of these Bitcoin pairs are down a lot, right? That doesn't mean they can't ever bounce. I mean, I'm sure some of them will, but they're down a lot. Dominance has put in a new yearly high, even though a lot of people said it was already done, putting in new highs this year, and it just continues to go up. So I think this is sort of proof that these rallies by dominance, it's more so relevant to monetary policy rather than just saying, all right, well, it topped in September of 2019, therefore, September 2023. No, it topped in September 2019 just before rate cuts. I'm saying, it could top out in the next couple of months or a few months before we get rate cuts sometime in early 2024. But until that time, I think dominance will go up no matter the direction of Bitcoin USD. At some point, if Bitcoin, if you look at Bitcoin USD, it seems like it's going in for some type of a blow off top, right? So whatever that ends up being, we'll get the initial retrace from that, and then perhaps a bounce after that. It could be that secondary that second bounce that you see dominance top out on. But until then, I think it's free to, the dominance of Bitcoin is free to keep going up, and you can see that altcoins are really struggling to keep pace. I mean, again, Ether, Bitcoin, if you look closely, you can see that these wicks on these weekly candles were putting in higher lows, and we are also getting lower highs. But this week, it's really starting to break down. It really reminds me of that week in late June of 2019. It really reminds me of this week right here, where it finally broke down right at the same time that gold was breaking out, and right at the same time that the market was starting to think rate cuts were about to happen. So if in a few weeks this metric is down here, or even tomorrow, I don't know, who knows? It might not be a few weeks. It could be this week, right? But whenever this metric is down here, that could be a warning sign, because that's where Bitcoin USD topped out last cycle. I think a lot of people are looking at this and thinking it's more similar to 2021. And I'm not saying they can't be right, but in 2021, we had already seen alt Bitcoin pairs, go down pretty far, hold those lows for a long time, rally back up to these levels a couple of times, and then they took off after this capitulation, right? But I'm saying, like, well, what if we're still in this part? What if we're still in this part over here and we haven't even gotten to this part yet? It's hard to say, but in terms of where we are in the business cycle, this part right here occurred just before rate cuts, which again, it seems like that's where we are right now, within a few months of rate cuts. So I still think that we're likely going into this phase where alt Bitcoin pairs break down. Bitcoin finds some type of a local top for a while that will likely act as a top, for a while, and maybe it'll act as a top for a lot longer than people think it will. But that's what I'm looking at. And hopefully these videos on dominance have been helpful. I know they're not always the most useful to everyone, especially if you don't value if you don't value your portfolio in terms of its Satoshi valuation, then perhaps dominance is not as useful. But if you do value the Satoshi valuation of your portfolio, then keeping your portfolio Bitcoin heavy this year and last year, I think has served you quite well. Note that sometime in the halving year, which is the election year and looser monetary policy, I would expect at some point in that time for dominance to top out and for altcoins to find some lows against their Bitcoin pairs. And then whatever their lows in their USD pairs are will just be based on how big the retrace is by Bitcoin. right? I mean, you can see that over here, Bitcoin had a pretty big retrace. It'll be based on all USD pairs. It'll just be based on how big the retrace is by Bitcoin. But anyways, that's mostly what I want to cover in this Bitcoin dominance video. We talked about alt Bitcoin pairs. And by the way, some of these alts against Bitcoin, I mean, like we looked at Ether Bitcoin. ADA Bitcoin is back to 955 sats. Dot Bitcoin is falling back as well. I mean, a lot of these, they had nice moves, but now they're sort of falling back in here. BNB Bitcoin breaking down, AVAX Bitcoin had a nice move, but it is starting to fall back. So these alts, they sometimes get these crazy moves, but there's no guarantee that it's going to be sustained, right? They could still just eventually bleed back to Bitcoin, which, given the fact that dominance put in a new yearly high, seems to be the case, that collectively alts have in fact been bleeding back to Bitcoin. So my target for dominance is I mean, initially I think 56% is going to be a level that it might find some resistance at, but I think it could still go to 60%, even though I know that has been an outlandish call by many, or it's been viewed as an outlandish call by many. I think that 60% is still in the cards, and it could happen a lot sooner than perhaps many of us think. But anyways, if you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. And again, check out the sale on Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Link for that is in the description below. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you next time. Bye.